everyone, my name is Rachel. I just wanted to welcome you to this video about what is DBT and who is DBT for. I have been intensively trained in DBT by Behavior Tech, which is the company that Marsha Linehan founded for DBT training. I also am currently pursuing my master's in social work, and I've worked in the mental health field for about 10 years with adolescents primarily, but also with adults, kind of using DBT as my backdrop for doing that work. So DBT stands for Dialectical Behavior Therapy. Great, okay, what does that mean? So let's break that down into the three words. Therapy, pretty straightforward, I think we know what that is. Behavior, or more specifically behavior therapy, refers to wanting to change a particular behavior. So behavior therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, refers to changing a particularly harmful or ineffective behavior by changing the way one thinks, so through cognitive means. So then dialectical behavior therapy refers to kind of dialectical philosophy. A dialectic is when two things that appear to be opposites or extremes actually can exist at the same time. So one example would be if you have a love-hate relationship with someone. So love, hate, we think of as two different emotions, but we use that phrase, having a love-hate relationship, to explain something that's not quite in the middle of the two, in the sense that it's between black and white is not necessarily gray. That's not what we're talking about. We're sort of talking about both love and hate existing at the same time, both black and white existing at the same time. So I like to think of dialectics as like the yin-yang symbol, right? So you've got both black and white, but you also have a little bit of white in the black and a little bit of black in the white. So it's thinking about thoughts, feelings, concepts, ideas, anything that appears to be extremes, where we can apply a both and description as opposed to an either or. So we're avoiding extremes, we're finding a way for both to exist at the same time. So dialectical behavior therapy changes behavior through actually targeting the behavior in particular. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the history. Dialectical behavior therapy was first introduced by Marsha Linehan in her book Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Borderline Personality Disorder in 1993. So in that book, she described a study in which she had chosen to work with highly suicidal clients attempting to apply cognitive behavior therapy. So she was a behavior therapist working to attempt to find strategies that worked for this population. So historically, highly suicidal individuals, people who had not really responded to traditional therapies, were being left out of research that showed those therapies to be effective because they weren't making as much progress as others. And so we were left with a lack of information about how to treat people who were really severely struggling and who weren't being as helped by some of the more traditional methods. So within this population, the very first research population that Marsha, I like to call her Marsha and pretend like she's my friend, that she brought together actually was all women. And what she found as she was doing the study was that they actually all met the criteria for borderline personality disorder, Originally, though, she did not know that as she was gathering the group together. She sort of said, recruited clients that had repeated incidences of self-harm, suicide attempts, suicidal ideation, and were maybe in and out of the hospital, just not getting the treatment that was helping them to get better. So while working with this population, what Marsha noticed initially was that cognitive behavioral therapy, as it was currently laid out, was not working for this population. So CBT is a change-oriented therapy. Essentially, CBT works around the idea of give us a problem that you have, and we're going to come up with a plan to change this behavior, change this problem, give us 12 weeks, and problem's gone. Change the behavior completely. And CBT works. It works really well, but it didn't work for this population. And the reason was that by presenting a change-only strategy, it left out a really crucial piece of therapy, which is this validation and this acceptance. And not only an acceptance on the basis of from the therapist to the client, but an acceptance of the client of themselves. And so the main dialectic that we work with in DBT is change and acceptance. Those two things seem like they would be opposites, right? If I'm accepting something, we tend to think about that as, well, I'm just allowing it to be as it is. And the reality is that's not quite what acceptance is. Acceptance can be acknowledging that something exists, but it doesn't mean that we aren't going to change it. And so DBT allows those things, and in fact encourages those things to exist at the same time in the way that we learn the skills, in the way the skills are taught, and in the way that the therapy is delivered, and in the way that clients learn to interact with themselves. So in the process of this study, Marcia also learned that all of the clients, being that they did eventually meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder, she found out, shared clusters of symptoms that were similar. And the symptoms I'm going to name are not necessarily the symptoms that you would go down the list, and if I say it and you check it off, then you have borderline personality disorder. That's not what it is. They're sort of general ideas of symptoms. And a personality disorder is at the extreme end of a spectrum, but most of us are somewhere along that spectrum anyway. So some of these symptoms you might be like, yeah, actually that I struggle with this piece, but not so much that. Or, I have a little bit of trouble with this. And so we're all sort of on the spectrum to some extent, but those who meet the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder are just further along the spectrum. And some of the things that she noticed were a lack of a sense of self, a feeling of emptiness or numbness, just not being able to decide maybe what one wants for oneself. And she was able to equate these kinds of symptoms with a solution, which in DBT is the first module of mindfulness. So she said, okay, we're going to use mindfulness skills to target this area of getting to know oneself, of tapping into one's body, one's feelings, and finding out kind of who am I and what do I want. And the second skill set she applied was distress tolerance skills, and this was used to counter symptoms that she knows of impulsivity, self-harm, for example. Often somebody is in distress. What's the way that they solve their distress? Sometimes this involves risk-taking behavior. So an inability to kind of cope with distressing emotions, or using really what are ineffective or perhaps harmful means of coping with that distress. Thirdly, we have interpersonal effectiveness. So what she noticed was that the research participants tended to have chaotic interpersonal relationships, maybe difficulty creating friendships, difficulty maintaining them. Borderline personality disorder in particular has one of its symptoms is a real fear of abandonment, of loss. And so that comes out in a multitude of ways, sometimes in anger and explosive kind of arguments, sometimes in pushing people away for fear of that abandonment. So all these types of ways of interacting with people that weren't creating satisfying relationships. And so interpersonal effectiveness skills are used to target those types of symptoms. And lastly, we had emotion regulation skills. So what she noticed is that in general, these research participants had a hard time keeping their emotions relatively balanced. We all sort of have a roller coaster that we go on through the days and through the weeks. But these participants maybe had more ups and downs in a day than we would consider typical. Maybe their ups and downs were more extreme. Maybe they responded to emotional stimuli much more quickly and much more intensely than someone else. And so they're particularly emotionally sensitive and reactive. And this made it all the more difficult than if you're encountering a distressing circumstance to handle that kind of emotion and find a way of managing the stress and using a coping skill to target it. So I am hopeful in this video series rather, to go through each of the modules with you, as well as providing some initial information about DBT and some of the basic concepts, so that together we can work through, okay, what are these skills? What are they good for? DBT skills that are taught in each of these modules are none of this is rocket science. Okay, so I don't have any sort of extra special magical knowledge to share with you, but the skills are life skills that some of us didn't get taught growing up. So maybe our parents struggled with managing emotions and we didn't have these skills sort of modeled for us. Maybe there wasn't anyone who explicitly taught it to us. A lot of social emotional learning is being brought into public schools now because kids need a way to learn these type of skills for their life. So essentially they're life skills for working with other people, for managing emotions, for managing distress, but also can really help somebody who's struggling at the more extreme end of the spectrum with potentially really risky behaviors. What I should say, definitely to kind of start off this series, if that you're experiencing any kind of crisis or engaging in any risky behavior that's potentially life-threatening, I encourage you to make a call to the crisis line or use the crisis text line, both of which I've included below. As its first sort of target, DBT names life-threatening behavior as first and foremost. So if you're engaging in self-harm, if you're experiencing suicidal ideation, please seek out some help, find a therapist for you. This is not meant to replace any therapy whatsoever. This is meant to be an informational tool to maybe supplement some things, and maybe for therapists to learn some skills, but this is not meant to replace therapy in any way. And I would like it if you guys would maybe click like, subscribe, and also comment below with what skills you'd be most excited about learning. So are you really interested in mindfulness? Is distress tolerance something that stands out to you? What would you like to see us talk about first? And I definitely would be looking for that feedback in terms of figuring out what to do next. Thank you for tuning in for this little intro, and I'll see you soon.